Hello. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Staci Herrin, and I today would like to present to you the research that I did in conjunction with my dissertation at the University of Southern Indiana entitled Administrative Motivation in the Growth of Virtual Education in Indiana. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I have been an educator for 21 years, all of those years spent within the Evansville Vanderburg School Corporation. And I have been a classroom teacher, a content director, a department head, and I am currently serving as the director of the EVSC Virtual Academy, which is a K-12 program for students who choose to take all of their schooling online. So they do all of their work at home with the exception of state testing. And currently we have about 500 students in this program. So, tell you a little bit of background information about my research. So, first of all, there has been a rapid increase in the enrollment in virtual education, even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. In the 2019-2020 school year, more than 480,000 American students in 40 states attended either virtual or blended instruction schools. And this is because virtual schools do meet the unique needs of a lot of different types of students. These can be students with physical needs, emotional needs, unique family situations, maybe certain responsibilities that they have. They also may need to take courses that might not be available in their traditional schools, or need a lot of credit recovery, or on the opposite end, maybe program acceleration. That said, most students are not successful in a virtual environment. We find that students encounter a lot of different challenges, including a lack of internal motivation and independence, struggles with the lack of interaction with peers, and also technology issues such as limited internet access and connectivity. We can see this lack of success when we look at certain statistics surrounding virtual schools. For example, the national graduation rate in the 2019-2020 school year was 85%, while full-time virtual schools nationwide had a graduation rate of 55%. In 2020, there were 11 virtual schools in Indiana. 3 received a state grade of C, 3 received a state grade of D, and the others did not even meet the requirements to receive a grade that year. Federal accountability ratings in 2019, which were the most recent, only one Indiana virtual school received a rating of approaching expectations. So we can see that it's not typically a very successful environment. Which brings me to the problem of practice. So virtual education is on the rise. However, we don't know a lot about why students continue, or why schools continue to open and promote and expand these programs in light of a lack of data that shows that they're actually successful. So the purpose of this study was to explore the reasons why Indiana public school districts chose whether or not to implement virtual programs. The research design was a mixed method sequential explanatory study. I gathered quantitative data through surveys, and then I followed that with interviews to gain qualitative data that would provide more details and more context to the answers. And I based all of this on a 2014 case study by Adams with the growth of virtual education in Kansas. I began my data collection in the spring of 2021, and I think that's a really important thing to note is that this was done in the spring of 2021, because this was before the Delta variant or the Omicron variant, and at this point, most schools did think that for the 21-22 school year, they'd be back to normal, and that obviously did not end up being the case. So I sent surveys to all Indiana public school superintendents. There were 290 of them, and 88 responded, which was a 30% response rate. I sent surveys to all the identified public school virtual program directors, of which there were 77, and I received 36 responses, which is a 46.8 response rate. There were a couple of limitations to this study. First of all, it did begin before the COVID-19 pandemic. We started writing the questions and doing the research before. And then the surveys, of course, were sent out, and the actual participants were contacted during the pandemic itself. So, because of this, as I began the study, there was a lack of updated information from the state level about virtual programs. They just didn't have an updated database. There was a lot of growth happening, and to be honest, we don't know if this growth will be sustained. Additionally, there was a disproportionate rural representation. In the state of Indiana, there are 28% of schools in Indiana are considered rural. However, for this study, 62% of the respondents came from rural districts. And then finally, there's always that limitation of bias when you have self-reported data. So I looked at 7 research questions, and we'll just very quickly kind of touch on the findings from each of these. These included the factors that influenced a decision to adopt a program or not adopt a program, as well as the benefits and challenges of virtual education. In addition, we wanted to look at the ways in which superintendents and program administrators vary in their belief of the ability of virtual schools to achieve educational goals versus the ability of traditional schools to achieve these same goals. Wanted to look at the perceived effectiveness of virtual education in Indiana. And then finally, of course, wanted to look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first research question asked respondents to identify the factors that led to implementation of their programs. And since this the top two answers were the same for both program administrators and superintendents, and this was the COVID-19 pandemic and credit recovery. Both those factors led to a real need for implementation. This is to be expected. Historically, there's a lot of data surrounding the use of virtual schools to meet the needs of students with health concerns, which is certainly what was going on during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's also a great depth of research about the need, meeting the needs for credit recovery in a virtual environment. Additionally, as you'll find here just in a moment, credit recovery was also listed by all of our respondents as one of the primary benefits of virtual education. I think it's also important here to note that the survey results did diverge from data from the interviews. In the interviews, there was a lot of discussion about financial impact of virtual schools and concern about students leaving a district to find a better virtual option. However, while we talked about that a lot in the surveys, that was not in the interviews, that was not reflected in the surveys. The second research question asked respondents to discuss those factors that led to the decision not to implement a program. So this was only sent to superintendents because obviously if you have a program administrator, you've decided to implement the program. So 12 superintendents responded that they had decided not to implement a virtual education program in their districts. And the most common response was that it didn't meet district goals. So the problem here is that we don't know what kind of district goals these superintendents were referring to. We don't know if these were graduation rates, if they were academic supports for certain subgroups of students. And then only one superintendent responded that they did not utilize virtual education because of its perceived ineffectiveness. And I found that surprising because there is obviously a lot of data, a lot of research dedicated to the lack of student success in a virtual environment. So the third research question asked about the benefits of virtual education. So first of all, for this question, we looked at whether or not the role of the respondent made a difference in how they answered this question. So whether or not you were a program administrator or a superintendent, did that lens make a difference in how you responded? So that did actually make a difference in 3 of these options. And if you can see these outlined in red, the red print on the screen, in 3 situations, the role of the respondent did make a difference. And that was in whether or not it was financially efficient, acceleration for students, and the opportunity to enroll students from outside the district. Otherwise, the top three answers, the top three benefits identified by both groups were the same. Offering an educational option during the pandemic, credit recovery, and offering learner convenience and flexibility. The least chosen benefit was higher quality instruction. It's also worth noting that program administrators identified nearly all of these factors as a benefit more often than did superintendents. The fourth research question asked about the challenges of virtual education. Again, the lens that the respondents were looking through, whether you be a program administrator or a superintendent, really made a difference in two situations: how you answered about student engagement and how you answered about community support. Um, it was interesting to note that superintendents were not as concerned about community support as the program directors. And I found this interesting simply because the superintendent is the face of the school district to the community. So it was interesting that they weren't necessarily concerned about the community support aspect. The top three choices, the top three challenges identified by both groups was the same: student engagement, the ability to offer quality curriculum instruction, and the opportunity to offer professional development for teachers. The fifth research question asked about the ability of traditional schools and virtual schools to meet educational goals. Um, Overall, traditional schools were highly favored, and there was a lack of confidence in virtual schools. Um, and we found, just as might be expected, that program administrators did see more advantages of virtual schools than did the superintendents. When looking at traditional schools, whether or not you believed that traditional schools were effective in meeting these 5 educational goals that are listed at the bottom of your screen: socialization, encouraging students for extracurriculars, student-teacher relationships, academic preparation, and citizenship, basically preparing students to be a good citizen. Um, in looking at those, the role of the respondent was significant in two situations: the strength of traditional schools to encourage students to participate in extracurriculars, and the ability of traditional schools to successfully prepare students to be good adult citizens. When looking at the same five indicators, the role in how virtual schools meet these educational goals, the role of the respondent was significant when looking at the strength of virtual schools to promote the development of strong student-teacher relationships, the ability of virtual schools to provide high quality academic preparation, and the ability of virtual schools to successfully prepare students for their roles as adult citizens. The sixth question asked about the effectiveness of virtual programs. And although the difference between the perceptions was not significant, the program administrators did view virtual programs in their districts as slightly more effective than did the superintendents. We found that the role of the respondent didn't play much of a have much of an impact on the way they answered this question, but that typically you did think your own program was effective. And the majority is, it's important to remember that the majority of virtual programs in Indiana are not considered full standalone schools. Rather, they are programs contained within the district. So if this is the case, respondents may have felt that their program was more effective because they may not have identified themselves as failing, because they understand that virtual schools in general may not meet student needs, but because they have a program, they may not have believed that they were failing. The seventh research question asked about the impact of COVID-19 on schools, teachers, and students. So I broke it down into those three groups: how COVID-19 impacted our educational system. So we'll start with school corporations. Um, we found that all this information was found through interviews. I interviewed 6 superintendents and 5 program administrators. And I found that COVID-19 impacted school corporations in that they had to make a lot of very quick pandemic specific changes to their technology plans. Some school districts did not have a one-to-one initiative in which each student has their own device. If they did not have a one-to-one initiative, um, if they did not have a one-to-one initiative, then they found that they had to quickly develop one or push along those plans. I also found in discussing the impact of on school corporations that there was a concern about the financial loss of enrollment and how they needed to really maintain this enrollment to maintain their finances. I also looked at, through these surveys, found how COVID-19 impacted the teachers. And in these interviews, the interview participants talked about the lack of professional development caused by a need to really push these teachers into these situations very, very quickly. And so they just didn't have time for the professional development they needed. They did see a lot of increased stress, of course, on teachers, as you might expect, but a byproduct was the development of new skills for the teachers. And finally, the impact of COVID-19 on students. This is all, reflected, of course, in past research, not pandemic related, but just general research about virtual education. But traditionally, there is poor attendance and a lot of truancy with students in a virtual environment. And this could be contributed to a lack of self-efficacy. Participants identified a lack of time management among students and concerns about parents trying to dodge consequences of legal actions. Those people I spoke with also identified a lot of social emotional challenges for their students, and they provided a lot of anecdotal evidence about the need for parental involvement. So all of this research leads to some recommendations, and that is just essentially that virtual education will likely remain an option for families and districts. So we've got to make sure that it's a viable and effective form of education. This is an opportunity to review existing programs and meet the challenges that everybody saw during the 2021 school year and design these virtual programs that meet the needs of students, teachers, and families. So we came up had a few conclusions. First of all, the participants' role in this study, be it a administrator or superintendent, had a very minimal impact on their perception of virtual education. Program administrators tended to have a lot more faith in the value of virtual education than did superintendents. And most participants tended to understand that virtual education is unsuccessful for most children. However, they thought their own programs were effective and met the needs of their own students. This really was just a snapshot of the 2020-2021 school year because it was such expansive growth. Um, and we don't know if that growth will be maintained. But it is important to note that the challenges and benefits seen by schools in this study are the same as seen in studies done during non-pandemic times. We confirm these findings with triangulation of the current body of research, the study surveys, and the interviews, all of which point to the same benefits and the same challenges of virtual education. Um, they didn't come up, these participants saw the same challenges and concerns as we've always seen in virtual ed, so they didn't come up with any new ideas. Rather, they're just repeating and seeing what we've always seen in this type of education. And then finally, only time and future research will tell how COVID-19 permanently changed the face of education and if the growth of virtual education will be sustained post-pandemic. Thank you.